On the morning of July 29th, 2025, the red soil of eastern Burkina Faso drank the blood of 50 of its sons, not in battle, not in defense, but in ambush cold, calculating, and brutal. No alarm, no resistance, just silence. And then fire. It was not war, it was a message. In the markets and mosques, whispers turned to gunfire. Who gave the order? Some said terrorism. Others, louder, spoke of power, the one that smiles in the daylight and strangles in the dark. The one that still believes Africa must kneel. But then a figure emerged, not from abroad, not from the boardroom, but from within. The people clenched fists, dusty uniforms, eyes dry from suppressed pain. President Ibrahim Traoré did not cry that day. He stood there, and by standing there, he said what millions have felt but never said. This is not where we fall. This is where we rise. Stay with us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and join us for an Africa that will not be left. And just days before the flames of that ambush, something else had sparked quietly, not on the battlefield, but behind closed doors. Decisions were made. Invitations declined, and consequences, it seems, were already on their way. Just 7 days before the bloodshed, President Ibrahim Traoré received 2 invitations. The first came on embossed paper from Washington, inviting him to an Achievement and Cooperation Forum. The second, more discreet, arrived via diplomatic back channel, an offer from a prominent Western-backed NGO to discuss development opportunities. Both were declined, not out of pride, but out of principle. To Traoré, they weren't invitations, they were tests, and he passed them by, walking away. But on July 29th, long before dawn broke over the horizon, something answered back, not with words, but with fire. At precisely 04:08 a.m., multiple explosive devices tore through a military installation near the eastern corridor. The base was not under-resourced. It had surveillance systems, early warning alerts, and secure comms. Yet that morning, every layer of defense failed. Drones monitoring their perimeter went offline moments before impact. Radio channels went dead. Backup troops never received a signal. It was as if the base had been blindfolded, just long enough for the killing to begin. By sunrise, 50 Burkinabe soldiers trained, equipped, and ready lay lifeless. The attack was surgical, not chaotic, not random. No group claimed responsibility. No manifesto followed. No demands were made. Just silence, a silence heavy with meaning. And across the country, that silence did not last. In the capital, whispers curled through alleyways and across airwaves. It wasn't Al-Qaeda, not insurgents. This was punishment. In villages, elders remembered other ambushes, other times when resistance met mysterious force. But this time, the grief was too fresh, the betrayal too sharp. Markets closed early, schools lowered flags, mosques and churches filled with quiet fury. Radio hosts cried on air, mothers sang old war songs, and on state television, there were no slogans, only the names of the fallen, read aloud, one by one, with no music, no graphics, no applause. Then came the funeral. It wasn't held behind palace gates. It was open, raw, a state funeral, without pomp, only pain. Traoré arrived not in limousine, but in fatigues. He stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving families. He touched coffins. He hugged children. He listened, really listened to the cries of mothers who had buried their only sons. And when it was his turn to speak, he said only this: "We buried heroes today, but we do not bury our resolve. Let the world know Burkina Faso does not grieve in fear. We grieve in fire, and that fire is coming." Those words, unbroadcast by foreign press, became gospel in the streets. By the next morning, murals began to appear, not of Traoré, but of the 50, side by side, uniforms straightened, faces calm. Behind them, the national flag and the words, "We heard the warning. Now hear our answer." No one doubted anymore. The attack was not an act of terror. It was an act of intimidation and a miscalculation, because instead of breaking Burkina Faso's will, it lit something the world wasn't ready for. Traoré didn't flee. He didn't ask for an international probe. He didn't appeal for sympathy. He gave orders, but for every bullet meant to silence, there rose a blueprint. And from the ruins of that base came the birth of something no one expected: an industry of resistance. Born on African soil, in a forgotten corner of Ouagadougou, nestled between shuttered warehouses and dust-stained fences, an old military repair depot flickered back to life. Not with ceremony, but with sparks, noise, and urgency. Welders fired up their torches. Engineers unfolded design blueprints. Mechanics returned not to maintain, but to create. This was not reconstruction. This was resistance. Under direct orders from President Ibrahim Traoré, the facility was repurposed into a classified manufacturing hub. No foreign contractors, no corporate consultants, just Burkinabe minds and Burkinabe hands, bound together by grief and grit. The goal was singular: build what we can no longer afford to beg for. They started with unmanned aerial systems drones, not imported toys, not off-the-shelf surveillance units. These machines were designed from scratch, with one mission: protect the land, the people, and the sovereignty of Burkina Faso. Every component, every circuit, every line of code was handled with the urgency of wartime. Young university graduates, many who had once studied under flickering lights and borrowed books, now stood shoulder to shoulder with retired military engineers, each contributing what they knew, each refusing to be helpless. The motto spread quietly at first, then loudly: never again will Burkina Faso be caught off guard. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a vow. Within 3 weeks, the first prototypes were airborne, their shapes cut across the sky, silent, angular, efficient, designed to patrol borders, scout forest trails, and track hostile movement, with real-time video feeds streamed directly to command centers in Ouagadougou. But the drones were only the beginning. Behind every takeoff was a network of self-built infrastructure, batteries adapted to Sahelian heat, cameras shielded from desert grit, flight systems encrypted with homegrown code to prevent foreign interception. No consultants, no imported vulnerability, just sovereignty engineered in silence. For those who follow Africa news, this was unprecedented. While other nations scrambled for international defense deals, Traoré turned inward toward his people, his soil, and his memory of 50 fallen men, and the people responded. Donations poured in, not from abroad, but from inside. Shopkeepers sent tools. Farmers offered storage barns. Retired pilots volunteered as instructors. Across the country, the project became more than an initiative. It became a cause. They called it Operation Colpelgo, named after a forest region where some of the fiercest anti-colonial resistance once took place. Foreign observers dismissed it as symbolic, a gesture of defiance. They wrote, until their satellites picked up something they didn't expect: a fully operational drone fleet in test formation, 12 aircraft, flying in sync across the eastern corridor, right where the attack had happened. No press release, no international validation, just quiet, deliberate progress. Inside the command center, a handwritten message hung above the entrance, written by a young technician who lost 2 cousins in the July ambush. This isn't just metal, this is memory, and memory does not forgive. And memory began to fly. Traoré visited the facility in secret, not to inspect but to salute. He walked the halls, ate lunch with technicians, left behind no speech, no signature, only a single sentence written in chalk on a steel support beam: build like they're watching, fly like they never will again. From that moment, morale soared. National news referred to the project as Africa's heartbeat in code and steel. It was a quiet revolution, not with parades, but with processors, not with fanfare, but firmware. And soon, neighboring nations began to take notice. This wasn't just about drones. This was about dignity, reclaimed bolt by bolt, flight by flight. The drones flew, the mines built. But even in their determination, Traoré knew true strength also lies in knowing when to open the gates and to whom. What happened next wasn't surrender, it was strategy. Exactly 48 hours after the ambush, a sound unlike any other echoed through Ouagadougou's military airbase. It wasn't mourning, it wasn't panic, it was thunder. the landing gear of a Russian military transport touching down on Burkinabe soil. No press, no protocol, no anthem, just steel, sand, and silence. From the belly of the aircraft came not aid workers or foreign officials, but 200 Russian Special Forces operatives geared, focused, and unannounced. They brought with them encrypted comms kits, counter-drone jammers, and tactical field stations. But they also brought something far more valuable, a new doctrine. Traoré had not begged for help. He had not flown to Moscow. He had not shaken hands under a camera lens. Instead, he invited cooperation on his terms, and Russia answered not with charity, but with training. These weren't mercenaries, they were instructors, and their mission was clear: help transform a wounded army into a deterrent force from the inside out. By week's end, over 800 Burkinabe soldiers had joined joint drills outside Kaya, alongside 150 Russian trainers. The simulations were exacting: border incursions, urban ambush response, coordinated drone deployment, and signal jamming under pressure. The world watched, some with interest, others with dread. Observers from Mali and Niger were present, taking notes not just on techniques, but on ideology, because this wasn't about skill building. This was about breaking a pattern. For decades, African defense was synonymous with foreign dependence, imported weapons, outsourced command, and borrowed blueprints. But now, 3 Sahel nations were learning from each other, not from colonial manuals, but from shared wounds. What emerged in those fields of Kaya would soon be named the African Doctrine of Retaliation. It was simple, powerful, and entirely homegrown. Its pillars were 4: total self-reliance, no foreign bases, no leased defense. If it isn't built here, it can't defend here. Civil defense integration. Every village becomes a node in the security network. Drone-first warfare. Speed, stealth, surveillance designed for African terrain. Economic countermeasures. Weaponized trade routes, local production, and supply chains in times of siege. For those following Africa news, this was historic, not because Russia had landed, but because Africa didn't bow when they did. There was no flag swapping, no pledges of eternal loyalty. The Russians trained, the Burkinabe learned, and the rules were made clear. This is our house. You're a guest. Traoré himself reiterated it during a closed-door address to his top military council, later leaked and broadcast by local radio. They think we're building an army, but we're building a mirror. One day, when they look into Africa, they will see themselves replaced. International reaction was swift. Paris condemned the move as destabilizing. Washington called it deeply concerning. NATO released a quiet advisory, but nothing stopped, because for the first time, their warnings no longer echoed in a room they controlled. And in the streets of Ouagadougou, people cheered, not for Russia, but for the return of choice. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso wasn't waiting to be saved. It was choosing who to walk beside and who to shut the gate on. And that choice, though radical to some, felt righteous to others. Because when your dead are buried without justice, when your skies burn without warning, when your alliances break with silence, you learn that friendship without respect is just a leash. And Burkina Faso, under the quiet fury of Traoré, had started to bite back. Captain Ibrahim's latest news trended once again. But even as soldiers trained under new tactics, something deeper began to rise, not in bunkers, but in hearts. Because no army stands alone. It stands on culture, memory, and a people who remember. Before soldiers returned to the field, before drones roared over borders, something deeper stirred within the soil of Burkina Faso, a remembering, not of tactics, but of truth, not of war, but of worth. 3 days after the funeral, Ouagadougou witnessed something no military operation could manufacture: a national gathering of spirit. Over 20,000 people flooded the capital's central square. They came not for speeches, but for prayer. Muslim clerics, Christian pastors, and traditional elders stood side by side, hands clasped, brows bowed. For hours, hymns and chants filled the air, not to mourn weakness, but to summon strength. Candles burned beside drums, incense rose beside rifles, and one chant echoed louder than all: "We will not kneel, we will not kneel." We will not kneel. The phrase became more than a chant. It became an anthem. In the city of Kaya, 15 artists painted through night and rain, crafting a mural that stretched 3 city blocks, each fallen soldier rendered with care, their names woven into the folds of the flag behind them. One mother brought her son to see it. She said quietly, "Your uncle's there. He's looking at you, so stand straight." In Pharma, musicians gathered in an old recording shack and gave life to a song titled "We Will Not Kneel." It was raw, unpolished, and beautiful. The chorus featured the voices of widows and orphans. Within a week, it had played on every major radio station and crossed 500,000 streams. It wasn't a hit, it was a hymn. Meanwhile, schools across all 13 regions began a project of their own. Teachers led students in planting what they called trees of freedom. 1 tree for every fallen soldier, 50 in each school, 50 roots to remind future generations that sacrifice grows legacy. In rural provinces, where signals fade and roads vanish into dust, the mobilization was no less powerful. Hunters came down from the Sahelian plains to share terrain tactics with defense units. Blacksmiths forged blades not for battle, but for honor, shaped and blessed by local priests as emblems of vigilance. Market women in Ouagadougou organized food drives. In one weekend, they delivered over 30 tons of millet, dried fish, and beans to military camps. When asked why, one vendor replied, "Because soldiers don't fight well on an empty stomach, and freedom don't grow in hunger." This wasn't coordination, it was instinct. From mosque to market, classroom to courtyard, the people of Burkina Faso moved as one, not towards violence, but towards vigilance. It was here that Traoré's vision crystallized. He didn't just want an army, he wanted guardians of identity. That's why he launched the creation of People's Preparedness Centers across all regions. Not barracks, not boot camps. These were hubs, part library, part training ground, part storytelling hall. Here, citizens learned how to disarm an IED and how their ancestors resisted colonizers. They trained to detect drones, and they memorized songs of rebellion passed down from griots. They stitched uniforms while reciting the names of martyrs. They wrote poems beside tactical manuals. This wasn't militarization. It was memorialization and transformation. In those halls, old men taught young boys how to stand with honor. Widows taught girls how to stand with courage. And faith leaders reminded everyone, a shield is useless unless the heart behind it knows what it's protecting. The world called it strange. Some called it dangerous. Others called it unnecessary. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was natural, because when bullets take your blood and silence takes your story, the only thing left to fight with is memory. And in that memory, a new Africa was waking. And while songs rose and trees grew, the world beyond Africa stirred. Some watched with hope, others with fear, because what started in Burkina Faso was no longer staying in Burkina Faso. 10 days after the massacre, something unprecedented happened in the dusty heart of the Sahel. 3 flags, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, were hoisted side by side atop a joint podium in Ouagadougou. There were no foreign observers, no English interpreters, only African voices speaking to African futures. It was called the Sahel Security and Sovereignty Pact. 3 nations, 1 vow: we will defend each other, with blood if we must. The pact laid out more than words. It mapped the infrastructure of a new power. 5 joint air bases across the tri-border region, a unified rapid response force of 500 elite soldiers, drone patrols covering over 3,000 kilometers of shared terrain, an arms supply chain built from Burkinabe factories and local mining output. And for the first time, military strategy meetings were held every 7 days. A rhythm unheard of in Africa's fractured past. This wasn't symbolic. It was structural. It was sovereign. For those following Africa news, it was clear the age of isolated resistance was over. The age of integrated retaliation had begun, but not everyone celebrated. In Washington, think tanks lit up like warning sirens. Within 72 hours, 3 separate policy briefs labeled Traoré as a rising nationalist threat. NATO flagged Burkina Faso as a point of instability. French media launched in offensive headlines alleging economic mismanagement, corruption, even chaos in Traoré's inner circle. But none of it stuck, because on the ground, something stronger than rumor had taken root. Results: recruitment into Burkina Faso's National Defense Corps surged. In the weeks after the pact, national enlistment hit 180% of pre-attack levels. Women continued to flood training centers. Villagers arrived on foot with nothing but an ID card and a will to serve. And abroad, the image of Ibrahim Traoré began to change. In Accra, Ghana, a 12-meter mural of Traoré, fist raised, was painted on a university wall. In Lagos, Nigeria, a student rally saw 8,000 marchers holding placards. Africa stands with Traoré. This wasn't politics. This was mythology forming in real time. Because Traoré wasn't just defending borders anymore. He was reshaping belief. He was proving that you could say no to the West without falling apart, that you could build alliances without begging, that you could grieve without retreating. Moscow praised him, but didn't own him. Beijing watched but made no demands. Only Western capitals, for all their concern, seemed unable to adapt. In Brussels, a confidential EU memo leaked in late August warned, if this Sahel model spreads, we could lose strategic influence in at least 7 African nations within 5 years. They didn't call it a rebellion. They called it a blueprint. And Traoré never needed to brag. His quiet steps were louder than their loudest critiques. Meanwhile, inside Burkina Faso, the military plants expanded. 2 more drone squadrons came online. Volunteer brigades in the north conducted coordinated defense drills. Civilians carried comms packs alongside AKs. Village girls learned drone navigation. Elders rewrote old proverbs for this new chapter of self-reliance. Even the African Union, long silent, began to feel the pressure. Social media exploded with hashtags. Africa for Traoré. Yeah, why, where are you? Burkina rising. Over 2 million posts in 10 days. Not bots, not campaigns. Just rage. Just pride. This wasn't about ideology. This was about identity. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Because as the drumbeat of history returned to African hands, one truth rang out clearer than ever. Burkina Faso is no longer just resisting. It is leading. And now, as 3 nations stand shoulder to shoulder and one name rises beyond borders, the story of July 29th no longer ends in blood. It ends in a beginning. Burkina Faso is no longer the shadowed outline on someone else's map. It is no longer the silent neighbor, the grateful receiver, the obedient student. Under the command of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, it has become the spark and perhaps the storm. The loss of 50 sons on July 29th was meant to fracture a nation. Instead, it forged one. From ashes came doctrine. From silence came song. From grief came readiness. And the world is watching, not with pity, but with unease, because this is not the Africa they planned for. This is the Africa that plans for itself. Burkina Faso. Latest news now means more than battlefield updates. It means invention. It means resistance that builds. It means unity not written on paper, but etched into people's skin, sung into their stories, planted into schoolyards, and as Traoré's fist rises again and again across murals, rallies, and borders, a question stirs not just in Africa, but in every descendant of Africa, everywhere. If one nation can stand, why not all? To the elders in Georgia, Mississippi, Baltimore who remember Malcolm, who marched with Martin, who still pray for Patrice, this moment is yours. 2, because what Burkina Faso is doing now echoes what you always believed. Freedom isn't given, it is claimed, and once claimed, it must be kept. If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim latest news will return not just with reports, but with reminders. Africa is no longer asking, it is acting. And as the drums of dignity sound from Ouagadougou to the world, let this truth ring out. Africa can do it. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.